Hello and welcome to a brand new recorded playthrough for the Bleak Tweezers channel of Multiman Publishing's Panzer's Last Stand. This is part of the Battalion Combat Series of games. I haven't featured this game series or this game on the channel before. The game designer of Panzer's Last Stand is Cole Fong. The series designer and game developer of this particular game is Dean Essig from Multiman Publishing, and also from historically from the Gamers as well. The Panzer's Last Stand game itself is concerned with the battles around Budapest in 1945, early 1945, between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, or the remnants of the Nazi Germany's army. It's a 4-map game, far too large to fit on the amount of space that I have to play on. We are reliant on the scenarios, of which there are many in the game. These just about fit. Some of them are quite small, and we're going to be looking at one of those. This is known as Operation Conrad 2. There were 3 Operation Conrads. This is the second one, of course, and these were attempts by the Germans to actually relieve the siege of Budapest, which the Soviets had been running. It was unsuccessful. All the Conrads were unsuccessful, and it was the last large-scale tank battles done in the Second World War. However, it is quite a tense situation, and it could have worked. The opponents, the Soviets, are of course just at their height of their capabilities as an army, so it's not your kind of Barbarossa overrun situation. The Soviets themselves are more than capable of not only standing up to the German army, but also to beat it back. And actually, once Budapest fell, the Soviets marched on into Austria and beyond at a fairly rapid rate. The Germans pretty much collapsed after this point in this sector of the Eastern Front. So as it's a series game, we have both a series rulebook and of course a game-specific rulebook for here. This is the first BCS title which has the version 2.0 rules, which is a vast improvement on the 1.2s for readability and for getting the point across of what you should be doing. The organisation of the rulebook is a lot better than previously. The version 2 rules are actually backwards compatible to all the previous series games. So there are 3 previous ones. There's Last Blitzkrieg, which you may have seen on quite a few channels as being played, which is based in the Battle of the Bulge. There is Blazing Chariots, which is based around Tobruk and the Afrika Korps versus the British 8th Army, 1942. And then there is Baptism by Fire, which is the Kasserine campaign, the Americans against the Germans and Italians in Tunisia. So those are the 4. There is a new game coming out, not sure when, but it's been announced, and it's a much smaller game than the others, which is known as Aracore, which is about the Germans and the Americans fight in Lorraine in late 1944, sort of around the same time as Market Garden, or just before. That's the game. We'll be playing, as I say, Operation Conrad 2. This is a 5-turn game, and we'll of course be looking at some counters, the map, and a few rules and sequence of play stuff as our standard intro. However, there is, with Last Blitzkrieg, there are a lot of channels which have explained the game system very, very well, particularly Nathan Wiseguy History and Tabletop's Edge particularly have gone through it very well. But there are some nuances to this game. There are some extra, particularly game-specific rules, which are fairly major in their effect on the game, which I'll go through. Plus, also some of the standard rules. What I'd like to do most in this is kind of like a learn as we go idea of looking at the situation and going, okay, we can do certain things within the rules here, there and here, and go through it. The BCS system is very structured. There's a correct way of doing things, if you like, as you're playing the game. And so once you get that idea, you then get the rhythm of the game, and you can then carry on and play. So first I'd like to run through the charts and tables, particularly the sequence of play. We have that down here in this chart. This is a fold over two-page player aid card, and this has the sequence of play here. And we have three main parts: the pre-turn phase, all activations, and then the game turn end. Most of the game is done in the all activations. This is optionally a chip pull system, but it's an activation done at the divisional level, where you activate a division at a time, possibly twice in a row, and then move on once that's complete to another division. But let's go through this in sequence. So in the pre-turn phase we have the reinforcements sub-phase. First thing you do is weather. The weather can be, you check not just the general weather, but you also check the conditions of the atmosphere and also the ground condition as well. Now that's normally in the series what you do. However, with this scenario you actually have a decision with just one dice roll. Normally it's two, and here you roll and you get one of three results. You get a poor weather, you get a normal weather, and you get a good weather. What are the differences? So there are two things that the weather affects, and they sounds rather esoteric actually, not your normal effect you'd think, which is the visibility, as in how far units can see, and also what's known as trafficability. And trafficability is all about the capability of being able to supply on minor roads. Poor weather has 1 hex visibility, normal is 2, good is 4. With poor and normal weather you have poor trafficability, and with good weather you have good trafficability. And I'll go through the significance of the trafficability when we get to activations. We define the weather, then we roll for air points and replacements. So for each side there is a little bundle of pages for each side where they have particular tables that are relevant. And this is game specific to each side, and they'll have an air points table and a replacements table. The number of air points you get can then be used for that turn, and they are abstract. There's no aeroplane counters or airfields or anything like that. They're just effectively a modified artillery effect in the game, which is itself quite abstracted as well. And then we have replacements, which again you roll on another table, and you have two types of replacements. You have normal replacements, and you also have what's known as AV replacements, which is armor value replacements, usually tanks and mobile units. And you can apply those. You apply the replacements, like I just said, and then you prepare reinforcements. So reinforcements that are coming onto the board, you stack them on their entry hexes. That's the reinforcements phase. Actually, also during the reinforcements phase, and it's not on the standard sequence of play because it's additional to Panzer's Last Stand only, you work out what's basically the supply of your formations. So in the series, up to this point, every formation could activate in a game turn. Sometimes they fail to activate, but they at least have the chance of activating. With this game, formations, the amount of supply available, I think, which is the point of this, is that only a certain number of activations could actually activate in a turn. There wasn't a continuous fight along the entire line sector. There were particular offensives, a bit like Conrad 2 as an operation. So therefore you are then going to define the formations that you are going to activate. And in what way they are going to activate in the turn. But I'll come back to that separately. Then on to assignment. Artillery, there are independent artillery points and units which can be moved around between the divisions. At this point you can do that. It's a two-step approach. If something's assigned to a division, you can unassign it, and then the next turn, as it's unassigned, you can then assign it. So in the process here you've got assigning unassigns and then unassign assigns, if you can follow me, of these units. So support artillery points and independent units. and then it was known as units enter or exit support. So there is, and it's quite a clever part of the game actually, that support units, these are usually things like anti-tank units, flak units, etc., that support infantry and support the main formations, can actually be put in a support mode. This means that they are, rather than existing on the map in a single entity as a unit, they are split up amongst the units of the rest of the division and provide a support value. And this is the point at which you decide whether a unit which is in support is taken from support and put back on the board, or one that is on the board is taken off and put in support, and this happens per division. So at that point you do that. Okay, so this is pretty much simultaneously while this happens on the reinforcements. Then we have a first player determination. There is an orders section here, which optional, which has been mandatory for a couple of the Battalion Series games, but here we're not going to be using them for this scenario. Then we have the first player determination, which is a dice roll on initiative, and the highest wins. That's the pre-turn phase. Now it turns into the all activations, which is all about initializing HQs, and then HQs are HQs of divisions, and you initialize the HQ, so this is going to operate right now, and then you run through the activation, and the activation here is all this, which looks pretty wordy, but we'll go through it fairly scantily because, as I say, I want to show how things are done in the game. Once you have one activation, you then have a possibility of a second activation, and this is down here. And if you don't, then that division is finished, or if you do, you continue and do the second activation, and then the division is finished, and then you move on to another activation. The standard rules say that there's a kind of flip-flop situation here. So if the first player is, say, the Germans, then the Germans activate a formation, then it flips round to being the Soviets' turn to activate a formation, and it's a choice thing. What you can also do is you can kind of weight that choice as well, but what you can also do is, except for the first activation, you can put chits in a cup and they can be drawn at random. I'm thinking I'm going to do the chit draw version of this as I'm playing this solo. That probably seemed like the right thing to do. Going through a normal activation though, here is what we do. We flip the HQ over, we do some preparation in which we check certain things and whether we want certain things to happen to that division. This is to do the check the supply, whether the division needs to be in prepared defence or to come out of prepared defence, which is a status for the division, and then just check again other things about supply, and then you can then choose to say I do a recovery activation. A recovery activation is to reduce fatigue, and fatigue is actually quite a big factor in the game, and this slows down formations as they become more and more fatigued, and you can take a recovery activation to actually reduce that fatigue. But normally that's normally an exception. You then have the snafu section, which you basically do a dice roll on what's known as the snafu table to discover what type of activation it's going to be. You can have a full activation, a partial activation, and a failed activation. A failed activation is pretty much you don't go anywhere, it doesn't do anywhere, it just sits there. In certain circumstances you can actually convert that to a recovery activation, a reversion to the decision back in preparation if you wanted to. Partial and full are activations. The partial is kind of like a half. Everything is kind of halved of the capabilities you have. Then you do what's known as objective placement. So if you've got a half or a full activation, you place objectives. Those are places where your formation wants to focus on. You mark that on the board, and anything within 2 hexes of that objective marker can be assaulted, attacked. An attack is a type of combat in this game system. Then you run your activities. During this is kind of a free-for-all within the division, so you pick one of the battalions and you start doing things with it. I won't go exactly through the sequencing here. I'll go through with the game that there was quite a nuanced way of moving these battalions, and then once you've moved everything, including the HQ and possibly what's known as its combat trains, which is its supply marker, you then clean up. So any extraneous informational markers that you put down, things like traffic or the objective markers, are removed from the board. You check the fatigue of the formation depending on what kind of things they did during their activation. You check for isolation, so any battalion which is unable to talk to the HQ will suffer losses. And then you check, well, you can volunteer to end there, or you can try and get a second activation, and depending on the formation unit, it's on a die roll whether you succeed or not. If you fail, you don't get it. If you do, you start again up at the preparation and the snafu and go through the whole thing again. After that, that's the end of the activation for that formation. The formation is effectively shut down for the turn, and then you'll go to the cup or your next selection as to the next formation to activate. Once you've done all the activations, you then go to the game turn in, which is very straightforward. All the HQs are restored to their pre-activation status. They're unused rather than used, and then you put the turn marker on and off you go on the next turn. That's a reasonably detailed analysis of the sequence of play. So let's have a bit of a look at the units we have here. This is the setup for Conrad 2 scenario, but I just want to go through some of the units, see what's on them, etc. So the unit here, this is an HQ unit. This is the 2nd Mech Corps. The number in the corner is its command range, that's in hexes, not MPs. And the 2 with the explosion, although it's difficult to see on the orange, is its inherent artillery strength for the division. And if we flip it over, this is what it's known as its used side. So again, we get the 10 range. We have the 2nd Mech, but then we also get the artillery, which is now below in the little orange explosion marker. We have a color coding which matches the units that actually match. Here you can see some of them there, that little sort of tan bar. And we have a movement factor of 12 there. That's in black, and black means a truck type of movement. And the little dice symbol there is the second activation value that you have to roll that number or greater to activate. So it's a kind of 50-50 roll, as you can see with the 2nd Mech Corps here. So before they've been activated, they're that side. Once they've been activated, they're on that side. And then generally, by convention, there's actually a marker which in Panzer's Last Stand, you tend to use that marker for the formation supply control. So generally what you do is you just, if you're not using that other marker, you just turn it upside down to say it's definitely completely finished for the turn. It has a symbol here which isn't really relevant for the HQ. It's kind of it's a mechanized corps. Even though these are divisions, particularly with the Soviets, they have things like Mech Corps and Rifle Corps, which function exactly the same as a division. It's just as if it's a name kind of thing. But they tend to be quite big, that's all. So looking at this Mech Corps, we have mechanized infantry units here. Take this one. This is the 4th Mech Brigade. They're brigades. And 2nd Mech, of course, is their ownership, and you've got the tan bar. The mechanized infantry symbol in sort of NATO style that they're using here. And then there's a little 6 in a yellow box, and all the units have these little yellow boxes, and that's the number of steps of the unit. If you want to denote losses on a unit, you put in the good old pollard markers there, and it's the top facing number. Underneath it tells you how many steps it got left. And interestingly enough, this is 6 steps, so even if it gets down to 1 step, all the other values on the counter count as full. You can take 6 hits, and up to that point it's fully functional. That 6th hit, it will destroy the unit and it'll be removed from the board. This is on its back side, as you can see. If we flip it over, it's got another side to it. And if we look at the numbers down at the bottom, so particularly there's a white arrow pointing upwards, and that's an attack arrow. So it's effectively an infantry unit that can do a regular attack. It then has a red 1, and the red is significant. That means it's got an armour value of a 1. Then it has a little number in the middle. It's a favourite on these kind of combat series, that there's always this little action rating in the middle, and that's very significant in this game. It's used probably more than the armour value itself sometimes. And finally, again, we've got the movement factor of 12 there, all the rest being the same there. That action rating can change depending on what side you're on. On this particular unit it doesn't. With these SS units here, you can see the armour rating value is 5. 5 is the maximum, so it goes from 1 to 5. So these are very proficient. This is only a 3 though here, and you can see that's an armoured cavalry unit, and this is a motorised infantry unit. Now, the fact of having an armour value and also having the attack arrow makes it what's known as a dual unit, as in it's an armoured unit and it's also a non-armoured unit at the same time, and it has certain advantages. Normally units that don't have an attack arrow, including some infantry units who are in their flipped mode. So if, for instance, I take this guy, flip him over, you'll see the arrow is missing, and it's known as an unprepared side. And not only can it not do a regular attack when it's on that other side, and the action rating is less, it also doesn't have a zone of control. There are two zones of control in this game. There's an armour value zone of control and a regular zone of control. Armour value zone of controls affect armoured units, and the regular ones will just affect infantry units. It doesn't affect armoured units. Although units that don't have an armour value can inherit one from a support unit. We'll go through that a bit later. Another unit on the board which is relevant here, and we'll look at the second mech one, it's actually off the screen here but I'll bring it onto screen, is what's known as the combat trains unit. That has two sides. It has no combat values at all, a bit like the HQ doesn't. They all look in the same format. It gives you the identification here, and on the back it's got the same thing again, but there is a kind of no entry sign there, which is when it's moved or been forced to move, you flip it to this side. So that's an established supply line, and that's not established, and it's known as ghosting. There is quite a lot of jargon which is unmilitary, shall we say, in the game system, and this is one instance. So the relationship of where this counter is to where the HQ is very relevant for supply. So this is stationed between the HQ and the ultimate supply source, usually a board edge. The distance between the two is relevant for supply, and also the status of this marker is also affecting supply, and therefore affects the type of activation you'll get, full, partial or no. Also whether this path between the two, if it's known as optimal, if it's between 5 and 15 hexes distance between the two. If it's closer, it's not optimal. If it's longer than 15, it's not optimal. Also, if you use this road type, which is known as tracks, so they're very, very unsuitable roads, so therefore you will get negative modifiers if between these two you put in, so for example, if I put this here and the HQ was here, whoops, always happens, that would be using tracks, and therefore you would get negatives. Now that would depend on the weather, and that's where that trafficability I mentioned initially on the weather roll determination, the trafficability will affect that modifier, may increase for poor trafficability. As you can see, this is the division or the core here, and therefore you would activate, move, fight, etc. with all these units once, maybe twice, and you would not move anything else on the board except for defenders who are attacked and needed to retreat, etc. All your other units stay put, and then when those 1 or 2 activations is over, Those units again will not move for the turn, saving things like being attacked and retreated, and you move on to other formations. Now normally, along with the HQ, is a stack of units, a stack of counters. I've kind of used a little device I used with my Wing Leader series. You might recognise it if you saw those series of videos here, of a little matching card area to put the information on. Now there is one of these for each of the divisions on the board or corps, and all the counters that would be stacked with the HQ are actually on here, and particularly important is the fatigue marker with a number on it, which will either have a number on it or there'll be a fresh marker which is not fatigued at all, and then fatigue goes from 0 to 4. 4 is completely exhausted, and that's a modifier for the activation again. You can have markers, say this coordination one. This is caused by one division corps actually stacking with or moving through a different one on the same side, which means that effectively you get command and communication difficulties because everybody's mixed up. So that earned during an activation by another formation will cause a coordination for that formation and also formation that it's kind of crashed into. This is an extra artillery marker. Oops, you can't see this one there. That's an extra artillery marker, so that supplants the number here. So actually there is 4 artillery points available to the division. Another thing that you'll see also is support units. So this is a support unit from another formation. We move in a little, and it looks mostly like a normal unit, particularly on this side. It has a number, it has an armor value, but this can be whatever the armor value, so it can be of 3 types. You saw the red one, which is a kind of active offensive support marker. It's known as red. It can be basically clear, which is what this is, which is known as limited support, and that's defensive only. And then you can have a black value, which is standoff, which is like a limited, but has a range effectively, and can sort of halfway between the two. And you can see the support line underneath here across the bottom. So there's no action rating and there's no movement. So this is a unit that's part of the HQ that moves along with the HQ, and this unit is then distributed its power, its limited armor value, to the units of the division which don't have their own armor value, or if they're a dual unit. But it can become a real unit. So this is a real unit, and as you can see, it's got the normal values. It has a number of steps, and it can take losses when it's in its support mode. A particular thing with the Soviets is that normally you don't have to have a support side of the counter to put the counter in to count its armor value for the whole division. However, with the Soviets you do. You can only put markers in that have the support line across the bottom there. That's fixed, and that actually is a big difference for the Soviet formations as opposed to the Germans or even the British and Americans in the other games. So these are put into the HQ, and you also usually put them with a marker which gives you some aid here, which is, this is a limited support marker because it's that clear outlined number rather than a red or a black, and if it was red it would be on red support, which is just the back side of the counter, but this is just informational. There could be a few other things there, but generally that's all you have with an HQ. So that's really the counters I want to go through. There are some informational ones which will come very apparent very quickly in the activations, so that'll be fairly obvious, but that's all I want to do for the counters for now. So let's have a look at the map. It's a glossy multi-man publishing type of map, a very similar format to a lot of their other games. Grading is done for for, well, not for height this time, but actually for clear versus rolling. And then there's forest. This kind of terrain here is woods. When it's in rolling, then it's also forest. This sort of dark patch here is known as slope. Then we have villages, and then we have towns here, which again are treated differently. Railway lines, which don't seem to have a huge amount of effect on the game, to be honest, aren't really used for supply at this kind of scale. We have these rivers here, streams they're called actually. There are bigger rivers. Let me think, you can just see it on the right here. This is the Danube River, which is a major river, and effectively is a boundary for the game, or for certainly for this scenario, and you can only cross at bridges. So these can form combinations, if you like. There are movement costs for leg movement, which is units with a white movement factor. Different ones for truck, which is black, and for tracked, which is the red, known as tack. And then also in combat, terrain is again slightly abstracted. It's not down to what particular terrain there is. If there is just clear, then there is no effect. If there is a combination of rolling, forest, woods, then that is known as affecting terrain, or terrain, and will give a modifier. Streams will give a hex side modifier, but there's no real further differentiation than that, with the exception of a city. And I don't think we have any cities on here. They look like the towns. The symbol is red. Budapest is a different itself. You can't actually see it. It is on the map, but you can't actually see it here because it's just off kind of that way. And for this scenario, it's a victory point target. So the Germans need to get across to Budapest and get some formations into Budapest, but there are no troops over there. There should be a garrison surrounded by some Soviet troops, but of course they're not actually in the scenario. It's just a target for the Germans to get to. The last thing I want to talk about here is this chart. This doesn't exist in the other games in the series, and this, as I think I said earlier in the introduction, it's kind of to narrow the focus of the major campaigns, but also has an effect on the scenarios as well. Each of these are the markers for each division or corps. At the start of the turn, during the reinforcement phase, at the end of the reinforcement phase for assignment, each side will receive an allotment of activations. There are 4 kinds. There is a primary activation, there is a secondary activation, there are surge activations, and response activations, and they kind of pair up. So surge and response kind of work together. Primaries and secondaries also work together. You'll always get the primaries and secondaries. Occasionally you will get the surge and response. The surge and response are all about particular offensives. Now, even though Conrad 2 is a particular offensive, it's not one which was backed up with this idea of a supply surge. So we don't actually use the surge or response markers. They're not used in the game. We use just the primaries and the secondaries. So depending on the side and depending on the date of the turn that you're actually on, you'll receive a number of primaries and a number of secondaries for each side. Now, there are 2 of these charts normally for the 2 sides, but of course we're just combining it for us because we're doing solo here. So the formations start up here in the available formations, and you receive a number of allotments. Say, for example, you've got 2 secondary, 1 primary on each side. For each of these activations, particularly the primaries to start off with, you will use those to place one of your markers. Say, for example, the 3rd SS Panzer. We'll use the primary activation, German activation, and we will place it into the primary box in Tier 1. So Tier 1 is about formations which will activate first, and then tier 2 is about ones which will activate second. You have to activate everybody in tier 1 before you can go to tier 2. Likewise, the Russians, if they wanted a primary, they could pick the 18th Tank Corps, and they'd also put it in primary as well. So these are pre-designated. Okay, if you were using Surge, you would use this box, and this box called Spoiled is rather special, and I'll come back to that in a second. At that point, these are all left in this formations box. If you have a new division that's coming in that's reinforcements, you place it in this box. As you go through the activations, these will activate first, and then you will then go to tier 2 for activations as well. Now I'm just going to really not concentrate on Response or Budapest. They're rather special ones with Surge and with also the garrisons. Second, we're going to go for secondary, reinforcements and spoiled again. There's 2 spoiled ones here. When these are all done, and when they're done, they're put into here. Note there's a snafu dice roll modifier to see what kind of how good their activation is, full, partial or none. Doesn't give you any bonuses here, although in Surges you do get a +1, and that's that extra supply idea, I think. Once these are done, then when it's that side to activate, then you use, say, the Germans are activating, you put the secondary activation down, and then you would pick one of these units, say the 711th Division, put it in the secondary box, and you would activate. Note they have a -1, and when they've finished with their activations, 1 or 2, you make them done, goes to the other side. When you run out of these activations, you run out. Now there is an exception. During the turn, if ever a non-active formation, division, corps, is either had a step loss against it due to an enemy formation, or its headquarters or its combat trains are overrun, it's known as jumped in the jargon for BCS, then their marker, wherever it is put into a spoiled box. So if, for example, we had the 18th Tank Corps here, if the 3rd SS Panzer Corps was activating, and while it was activating it hit the 18th Tank Corps and caused a step loss, that 18th Tank Corps marker would not stay there. It would move to the spoiled box, and in particular the unused box. You can see these little green arrows. Now this is a worse activation, so there's a -1 on here. So this represents that the Tank Corps was unprepared for the attack and is trying to respond to the attack in a sort of more desperate manner or disorganized manner than it would normally do if it just did a normal activation. And when it's finished, it will go to done as well. So we get in a situation like this. With the secondaries, if, for example, the 18th Tank Corps wasn't hit, but the 62nd Guard Division here was hit, then because it's not in tier 1, it will be put in tier 2 unused. And as you can see, their die roll modifier is even worse. Now the one thing is these activations here, particularly the ones in tier 2, do not count against these activations. Okay, you will get an activation, it's kind of for free as a response, but it's not a very good one you've got. And as I understand it, the meaning behind this is that during an activation you look for formations to have isolated units and they will take losses, so that if you damage or you jump the HQ or the combat trains of a particular division, it will automatically activate to make sure that if it's kind of surrounded or something like that, or it will have to activate and deal with the fact that it may have isolated units. So they don't get off scot-free because of this restricted number of activations that you can have in a turn. They have to activate and then suffer the consequences. It's sort of a bad thing rather than a good thing. The other thing here is you have the reinforcements box, so if something comes in with reinforcements, it is activated here and gets a +0. There are a few other things here. So normally each formation could have a first and maybe a second activation. However, if you're in a tier 2, if you're in secondary, you can't have a second. You can only have one activation. All the others you can, except for, of course, spoiled you can't. Up in tier 1, spoiling here, still allows a second activation. So the big thing is between primary and secondary is these guys possibly get 2 goes, these guys don't. There's no chance of the second activation. And that kind of polices what is quite a big 4-mapper, so that not everybody is constantly moving and fighting and it's all focused into particular areas of the board because you're restricted with the number of activations you can have. Right, that's about all I wanted to go through for the moment. There's a lot more to it, but we'll do that through gameplay. Yeah, that's our introduction for Panzer's Last Stand, Multiman Publishing, the Battalion Combat Series latest game.